Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode, we bring you insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Now in this week's episode, we're going to hear about how they're tackling sheep scab in Northern Ireland. We're joined in this episode by veterinarian and sheep farmer Paul Crawford, who's chairman of the Northern Ireland Sheep Scab Group. We discuss various routes of transmission and the factors that are involved in the spread of mites. Paul takes us through the treatment options and the challenge of developing resistance to some of these, highlighting the importance of best practice. We discuss some of the findings from his Ph.D. studies on the number of outbreaks, disease awareness and treatment practice in Northern Ireland flocks. Finally, we finish up the discussion when Paul explained a new project that was launched last year to tackle the issue on farms. We start off, however, with Paul explaining what the cause of sheep scab are, the clinical symptoms and how to diagnose it in the flock.
Sheep scab is a highly infectious disease of sheep, and it's caused by a small mite, the Pseuroptes ovis mite or the sheep scab mite, and that little mite lives on the surface of the sheep's skin. It doesn't even bite into the skin. It just scrapes the surface of the skin and eats what comes off the surface. And after it's eaten, it goes to the toilet, and it's the poo of the sheep scab mite that the sheep is allergic to. So the signs that we see where they're itching and scratching, that's not really them trying to get the mites off because the mites are biting them. It's they're feeling very itchy because they're allergic to the sheep scab mite poo. And that's what causes the clinical signs.
In terms of identification of it, like from the early stages, Paul, to when it's more obvious to everyone, how would you go about identifying it?
Identifying sheep scab in the early stages can be difficult. You can't really see the mites with your naked eye unless you're really experienced, and there's quite a few of them there, and you've got good light. So early stages, you're not, as a farmer, even as a vet, you're not going to spot it just with the naked eye, just parting the wool and looking at the surface of them. Lice, you might sometimes see with your naked eye. They're a bit bigger. So if you see lice, that's maybe a clue as to what's going on, but doesn't mean that the sheep doesn't have both problems. So the early signs are restlessness, usually scratching and nibbling in around their shoulder area, trying to reach up there with their back leg and scratching around their the shoulder, turning their head around and trying to nibble between their shoulder blades. The reason that's the area that they're focusing on is because that's the one area that sheep can't really reach with their feet or with their mouth, and that's where the sheep scab mite parks itself first and feels safe because it's not going to get pushed off by a foot or nibbled off by a mouth. And that's where they set up and start breeding, and that's where they start the infestation. So it nearly always starts around the front end of the sheep, up around the shoulders, over the top of the shoulders, and you see dirty marks first, and that's just the dirt off their hooves as they're constantly trying to scratch. And then you start to see bits of wool coming out along the middle of their back, and then it slowly spreads down their side as the infestation gets more and more advanced, and sheep will spend more and more time scratching, rubbing on fences, rubbing on gate posts. And when you get up close to them, you'll see that there's thick scabby lesions on the skin, and those are some of the classic signs of sheep scab. But the signs can vary, and even in a well-established infestation in a flock, you will have some sheep that will have no signs, and you'll have some sheep that will be practically bald if you leave it long enough.
Paul, maybe in the early stages, to differentiate between a lice infestation, if you're not physically able to see it, and scab, can you take it a step further?
Yes, there are diagnostic tests available, and you can either get the vet out to look at the sheep or take a selected sample of sheep to the vet. And the first thing that often we'll do is take a little scraping of skin, and they take that usually from the edge of the lesions because the mites don't like living out in the open. So once the wool's gone, you'll not find scab mites in that bald patch, but you'll find them in the wool at the edge of those bald patches. So they'll go around the edges of the lesions. Don't be surprised if they part the wool and go looking somewhere that doesn't have obvious bald bits. That's because the vets know the best chance of finding them is actually in the wool and at the edges of the wool, not in the big scabby bald bits. So they might take a scrape of skin there, look at that under the microscope, and if they see a mite, you've got the answer. But you don't always see mites. Even in cases that look really classic, you don't always see mites. So the next step then we can do to confirm that it's sheep scab is to take a blood sample, and we can send that off, and there's a couple of laboratories in mainland GB that will analyze the blood and tell you whether the sheep have been exposed to sheep scab or not.
So when we get a confirmed diagnosis, when it gets to the stage where it's developed on sheep, it's going to have a big impact on them.
Yes, it has a big impact on welfare, and also has a production impact. sheep will get to the point that they spend so much time itching, nibbling, and scratching that they actually just give up eating. They're so bothered by the itch that they just don't eat. They lose body condition, particularly at this time of year when there's not a lot of nutrients in the grass and they're maybe having to do a lot of walking to go and find enough grass to keep going. So it'll really knock the condition off store lambs or pregnant ewes at this time of year when you get an infestation. Body condition drops, and then for particularly thinking of the pregnant ewe, that'll have an impact on lamb growth. It'll have an impact on colostrum production, and if you have no colostrum or limited colostrum, then that's going to impact on animal or lamb health, lamb viability through those first few days and weeks. So it can really snowball the production effects from even into the next generation.
So Paul, like the mite itself obviously can survive on the host. Just in terms of transmission, you might just explain like the common routes of transmission, sheep to sheep, but can it survive off the host for long? And is that a risk as well? So traveling through marts, livestock trailers, where do we go? What is the risk factors there?
Sheep to sheep transmission is definitely your number one route, and the number of mites on an infested sheep can rapidly get into the thousands and tens of thousands. And it literally takes one of those mites to move on to another sheep to start off an infestation on the next sheep. So sheep to sheep, and particularly at this time of year where we start trough feeding ewes prior to lambing, house sheep prior to lambing, house lambs for finishing. If you've got those sheep touching each other all day long, it just goes through like wildfire. The mites also do survive off the sheep, and this is what makes it such a good parasite. If you understand what I mean, it makes it why it's so good at spreading from flock to flock, as well as within a flock. The mites can survive off the sheep for 17 days. Normally, I talk to people when I'm talking to people or getting people to look at their risks. I talk about 3 weeks because 3 weeks is much easier to think about and remember in your own mind. So if a sheep that has scab has been in a field or in a pen or a trailer, unless you're fit to clean that properly, you shouldn't let any other sheep in that area for 3 weeks to make sure they don't pick them up. And that can be the other side of a fence. If it's just a single barbed wire fence and there's wool hanging on that wire, you have to count the field on both sides of that fence as being potentially contaminated with mites. So if you're moving them from one field to another, it has to be from one field to one that doesn't even bound that field where the sheep with the scab mites were. A double fence with a hedge it may be acceptable, but single wire fences doesn't make it a separate field as far as the scab mites are concerned.
So Paul, that has big implications for anyone from a biosecurity point of view. We say if you have a closed flock, there's that risk period before you can actually see it in your flock, and especially for somebody buying in a mix of store lambs or buying breeding sheep from, say, public auction, that it is a risk that's going to be there for a while.
It's a risk that's going to be there for a while. And it's not just that it takes 3 weeks that you'll see signs in your flock. The signs, if the sheep get infested with mites coming through a market or coming through a dealer's trailer or through a scanning system that hasn't been cleaned properly, it can take 3 months before you actually see the signs in your flock. It can take months and months for the numbers of mites to increase sufficiently to cause the sheep enough irritation for you to see signs, particularly when it is that indirect transfer. When it's transferred from one sheep to another and they've been close to each other and hundreds of mites can jump from one sheep to another, the signs can appear very quickly. But when it's only a small number of mites picked up in transit or picked up off the environment, it can literally take 3 or 4 months before you see obvious signs on your own flock. So from a quarantine point of view, just looking for signs for 2 or 3 weeks isn't sufficient. You have to do more than that.
It's an interesting point that, and often if you were at the point where it's 5 or 6 months later, you'll have forgot where did actually the source come from.
It can be difficult further down the line, and some of the conversations I've had with farmers over the last couple of months, it's taken us a while to work out where there was any risk factors. And yeah, we've been going back to the summertime, and yes, there were 4 stray sheep walking up the road, and I stuck them in one of my fields just to get them off the road.
The penny drops.
Yeah.
Look, just and that last analogy used, in certain situations, commonages, for instance, it's going to be difficult to control unless there's a whole plan for that commonage to actually control it. We'll come on to aspects of control in a moment, but there is circumstances there where it takes more than just a single flock approach.
It nearly always takes more than a single flock approach unless you have a good double fence boundary the whole way around your property, and you know how it came in. You made a mistake when you were purchasing, or you had an accident, or somebody sheep strayed. But there's very few flocks in Ireland, certainly very few flocks in Northern Ireland, when you take in winter grazing, when you take in conacre ground, that have everything adequately fenced to stop sheep scab getting in. And if you treat your flock and you know it came in from a neighbour, unless you can stay away from that neighbour until they treat their flock, it's just a time bomb. It's just waiting until the protection that from your treatment is worn off, and then it's just going to come straight back over that hedge again.
Something we're going to touch on again in a moment, but you led into something that's a treatment option. So how do we go about controlling this? What are our treatment options?
We've got currently there are two groups of products licensed for treatment of sheep scab. There's a dip, which is an OP organophosphate based dip, and there are a collection of injectable products that are all similar. They're all related to each other. They're all ivermectin type drugs, ivermectin, doramectin, and moxidectin. So people might know them better as Ivomec and Dectomax and Sidectin. There are a lot of other trade names, particularly the Ivomec. There's a lot of trade names about, but the three drugs are quite closely related. And from the point of view of controlling sheep scab, we have to consider them just as one drug. If one works, great. If it doesn't work, swapping to a different injectable is not going to make any difference. There is resistance well documented across Great Britain. We have seen cases in Northern Ireland where we haven't been able to confirm it in the laboratory, but we're completely convinced that there are resistant mites. And I cannot believe that there are no resistant mites in the south. It just doesn't stand up statistically.
So it's similar to what we talk about. We're talking about wormers, that when you treat them with injectable ivermectin, that the mites are actually surviving that treatment.
Correct.
Okay. With the dips, is that a potential risk, or the products, the OPs that are used for dipping?
We only have one currently licensed and available, and currently there's no evidence of resistance to that product. There is in other parts of the world resistance in other insects and other creatures that it's been used to control in the past. So we know biologically other creatures can develop resistance to it. So it's probably a matter of time. It's probably a biological inevitability that resistance will develop to the dip product, particularly if we misuse it, if we don't use it carefully and appropriately, if we don't make up the bath to the correct strength, if we don't top the bath up correctly, so that we make sure that every mite is exposed to a large enough dose that's going to kill it. And also that we avoid using it in shower systems, because shower systems are an ideal way of exposing mites to a less than therapeutic dose, a dose that's not high enough to kill them, but it's enough to get them that information that they need to start developing the resistance and start selecting for mites that are resistant to it. So we really have to be careful that we use the dip properly to protect it, because if it goes, we're left with nothing as things currently stand.
So it's a very similar picture, like improper usage, under dosage or under exposure of the correct amount of product, maybe overusage in the case of the ivermectin injectables, can all contribute. And I suppose just to clarify, like we're talking dip here, we're talking plunge dipping, and plunge dipping done correctly.
Yes, plunge dipping correctly. You need to know what size your bath is. You need to put the right amount of stuff in. You need to count the sheep as they go through. You need to make sure the sheep spend their full minute in the bath, make sure their heads go underneath. We recommend twice underneath to make sure that the ears get well flooded, because that's a favorite place for mites to hide. And make sure that as you count your sheep through, that depending on the size of your bath, every X number of sheep, you top the bath up. And the dip comes with a wee card that reminds you of how many sheep you should allow through the bath, and then how much stuff you need to add to top the bath up.
Paul, it's probably one thing we moved away a little bit from in the last 20 years probably, was plunge dip. And I suppose the fact that ivermectins were so easy to administer was one of the great successes of them, but also one of the pitfalls of them. Going back to the plunge dip, like there is mobile operators with it as well. We see a few new units being put in on farms. For effective control going forward, it probably is something we need to consider a lot more at farm level.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful about not overusing them, because again, they are potent chemicals, and the other risk to losing them is that either the environmental damage that we do through letting the dip get into the environment because we're not careful doing it, or the damage we do to our human health, because again, they're not nice chemicals and they do affect human health. So if we affect too many humans, or if we affect the environment too much, there are other regulators out there who would probably be quite keen to see that these chemicals weren't in our hands. So we really have to be very careful. And the contract dipper provides a great option because they're doing the job day in, day out. It's their business. It's real investment in them in getting the skills to do the job well and do the job right, maintain a reputation for doing the job well. And they can bring the dip with them and provide a professional service. They also bring an extra labor just in the person itself that brings the dipping unit. And labor on farm is often a hold up to getting any work done. So that's another advantage. Yes, you're going to have to pay a fee, but probably the contract dipper for most people is the route to go rather than rushing out and digging a hole and putting a bath in at this stage.
It's a good service, and as you indicated there, it's an extra pair of hands as well. Look, you touched on a number of aspects of this. In terms of awareness of control, I know you've done a bit of work on this back a number of years ago. How aware are farmers of the problem, of the control options, and is there pitfalls there, or is there gaps in that knowledge?
Yes, so 2021 in Northern Ireland, we had a survey as part of my PhD, and we found quite a lot of gaps in knowledge. People didn't appreciate how long the mites could survive off the sheep, so they didn't understand how much of a risk that was for it coming into their flock. People thought the sheep would get itchy very quickly. So again, if they were just using their eyes to determine whether it was safe to let bought-in sheep mix with the home flock, there was risks there. When it came to the treatments, we didn't quite ask enough questions to work out whether the farmers were being given the wrong information or the farmers were making it up themselves. But there was a lot of treatments being suggested or being outlined that people had followed or attempted to follow that just clearly were not, they weren't licensed to be used in sheep. They weren't licensed for sheep scab control. And people talked about how they had failures. They'd tried showering them and it damped them down. They stopped itching for a couple of weeks, but within the month they were as bad as ever. And then they had to go and get the plunge dipper. Those sorts of scenarios, just using injectables, but not using the right product at the right time. So some of them need to be used twice, not just once. And some people missed out on that. So again, it damps the itch down for a while, and then it comes back with a vengeance. So there certainly was a lot of evidence of misunderstandings. And then last summer, we ran a series of meetings for prescribers, so both vets and the farm merchants, as well as for farmers themselves. And the discussions in those meetings highlighted it wasn't only the farmers that were confused. There was certainly confusion amongst some of the prescribers as to exactly how some of these medicines needed to be used.
It's important that the correct protocol is followed, as you indicated there, even with ivermectin. Some of them are 2 shots versus some of them being 1. It's a simple slip-up, but it's one you could actually see happening at farm level.
It's one we do see happening on farm level, and we've got the evidence for it. There's 1 shot, there's 2 shots, there's into the muscle, there's under the skin, there's the dose rate. So the dose rate for something like Dectomax for worms is 1 mil per 50 kilos, but if you're using it for scab control, it's 1 mil per 33. And sometimes farmers might be a little bit shy about talking about scab, and if they know that Dectomax will do scab because they know that from some knowledge that they have, but maybe don't know about the dose rates. But if they just go into the merchant or into the vet and say, can I have some Dectomax to worm my sheep, and don't actually mention that they think they have a scab problem, nobody might highlight and underline that there's a special dose rate you have to use for scab. And if they just carry on using the dose rate they've always used for worms, then it's going to fail, and nobody's going to be any better off for it. So there's a lot of ways that it can happen.
It's probably one of the other hang-ups with actually getting the grips with sheep scab is there's a hang-up in talking about it. There's a bit of a negative connotation with it if you have it, as opposed to just get on and deal with it.
Yes. And in the people that we've talked to, both through the survey and also more recently through the current meetings that we've had, there's a certain, some people do feel some shame that they've got scab into their flock. And as we've talked about, you can have a pretty good setup. You can have a closed flock, and you can have a neighbor, you can have a poor boundary, or you can just have that well-meaning member of the public turning some stray sheep into your field. And you can get a problem. It's not necessarily a sign of being a bad farmer. Not doing something about it might be a different matter. But certainly getting it in the first place does not mean that you're a bad farmer or that you have poor standards or poor biosecurity. It can get in so easily and can spread so rapidly that it's just hard to avoid in some areas. There's so much of it about, and because it does survive off the sheep for that sort of nearly 3 weeks, movements of scanners, movements of clippers, movements of even farmers, labourers, people who help on one farm and help on another farm, sharing of trailers. And it can stay hidden for so many months before you know there's a problem that you can be helping a neighbour and you can bring a problem to their farm when you're helping them out with something else and not even realise that you have it on your own farm until it's far too late.
No, I think it's a point well made. It is very transmissible. As you said, it's a very successful parasite. Look, in terms of doing something, you kicked off a very interesting project last year. You might tell us a little bit more about it and what the aims of that project are.
Yeah, so in the north, it's a notifiable disease in the north. That said, when we went to the Department of Agriculture and asked them how much sheep scabs are in the country, they didn't know. They could tell us that on average over the previous 5 years, they had identified one to two cases a year over the previous 5 years. And that just didn't sit with any of us in the group that had been looking at scab, because some of us knew that many people on our own road, never mind the whole of Northern Ireland. So we knew that there was issues with information being shared. The scab survey that I did as part of the Ph.D, it highlighted of the 122 people that responded to that survey, 44 of them had scab in the previous, at least once in the previous 5 years, some of them 2 or 3 or 4 times. So again, that didn't fit with this 1 or 2 cases a year the department were talking about. So we managed to get some money together, and we thought the only way we're going to find out where scab is if we offer the farmers something in return. The political situation in Northern Ireland means we can't do anything about it being a notifiable disease, because to change that, we need a legislator, and currently they're on sabbatical, shall we say. So we had to offer the farmers something, because they were going to have to stick their hands up and say, I think I've got scab. They were going to be dealt with under a notifiable disease. They were going to have restrictions put on them. They were going to have letters from the ministry, all the things that farmers just don't like and fear. And actually the fear of those ministry, the fear of the restrictions has proven to be quite a barrier to us even engaging people in the scheme. And the scheme's offering to pay for their vet's bills. So we'll pay for the vet to go out and do any tests that they need to diagnose it. So pay for the vet's time, pay for the diagnosis, pay for the testing. We're also paying for the dip or the injectable. We did have to put a cap on it for very large flocks, but it's still a significant contribution, £400-500, so €500+ we were putting on the table to farmers if they said they thought they had a problem and were willing to engage with us. And despite the amount of scab that I know is out there from the phone calls, we still had a little bit of trouble getting people to engage. As one farmer said to us, they're £400 too scared of the department to phone you and engage in your scheme. Now, more recently, as it approaches lambing time and people are in a real panic on farm because they've tried things themselves, suddenly we've had a lot more interest in getting support and getting help, particularly for some of the people who have already paid out at least once themselves trying to treat the problem. And people are a little bit more inclined now to talk about it and come forward. So we're getting good uptake now. But it was slow getting going because the fear of the department, the fear of those restrictions, the fear of the notification really was top of the list when people phoned up and asked about the scheme and then went, maybe not. So there's a lesson there to be learned that notifiable diseases are, it's great to have some diseases notifiable because sometimes you do need a stick to deal with some of the farmers, or you need tools to get control of them. But if that's actually hindering people coming forward and talking about it and getting good advice and getting the disease stamped out before it spreads onto the next farm and the next farm, then that's suboptimal.
Well, it's interesting, Paul, that issue, if you're starting to gain a bit of traction, and like a lot of these things, it'll probably be slow at the start until you get a bit of build, but there's a bit of an organic spread when you get farmers involved in it, that they talk in an area, and hopefully from that you'll generate a bit more push or awareness of it and how to go about treating it correctly. Yes,
we have seen a few cases where a farmer has phoned up and said, I was involved in this, or my neighbour was involved in this scheme a wee while ago, and I think I've got a problem now. So we are starting to see that bit of that sort of growth, that farmers talking. The other one that's worked very well is where vets start talking. Vets who have a good relationship with their farmers can get the farmers past the fear of the notifications and get past the fear of the paperwork. And there's one or two vets in particular areas who have provided quite a number of cases to the scheme. And when you start drawing those out on maps, you see why see why scab can be such a problem and how it can be hard to avoid when you see how many people within a small area that we're aware of have it, never mind the ones that haven't come forward.
There's benefits to other clients in that practice as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Paul, that scheme kicked off last year. How long is it planned to run for?
Scheme kicked off in the autumn. We got funding for a 1-year program. So that program started in the summer with farmer meetings and then moved on to the on-farm activities in the autumn. And yeah, we're probably 3/4 to the way through the funding. So the money is going to run out probably about when it should run out at the end of the spring. And then we'll have a little bit of time to write it up. And then we're going to have to start working on what we do next, how we take the information that we gain from this study to develop a better control program for scab in the north. And any scab control program in the north also has to deal with the fact that there's a border which, never mind some humans not accepting that border's there, the mites certainly don't accept that the border's there. So to get scab control in the north, we're going to need to raise awareness in the south and try and get guys in the south to come on board and say, look, this is a disease. We've had enough of it. We're running out of treatment options. Let's do something about it now while we've still got the chance. Because say if dip goes off the market or they get resistance to dip, that only leaves the one solution, and that's flock clearances. And that's what they had to do to get rid of it in New Zealand. It's been eradicated from New Zealand for over 100 years. They didn't have the technology we have now. They didn't have the products that we have now. And when the products they had stopped working, they just shot the flocks and cleared them out. And that's how they got rid of it. And if we lose, we've already lost injectables effectively. They work on some farms, they don't work on others. If we lose the dip, we'll have no fully effective treatment. And we may end up in the situation where on welfare grounds, we have to take flocks out. So we have a chance now before that happens to deal with it. But it's going to take a lot of effort across the whole island. In GB mainland, there's programs all underway in Scotland, England and Wales. There's a national objective to have it eradicated by 2031. It's been done before. GB mainland, the islands, the Scottish Islands, etc. They were clear of scab for 20 years. We just never quite got the north and the south over here working together collectively to deal with the problem. And then it eventually made its way back across the Irish Sea into GB mainland. So it's been done before. It's been done recently. It's not easy, but it's doable.
Paul, it's an important area to focus on. And look, I think the project is a great way to start delivering that on the ground. And look, you'd be commended for the work in it. Appreciate you coming on me today and talking about it. So I hopefully will catch up with you again later on in the summer, maybe when you're a bit more of that detail pulled together. We'll hear how it's gone.
That would be super.
Paul, good having you on. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
We'll leave it there for this week. It's a very important area and it's great to hear that there's work on the way in it. I'd just like to thank Paul again for coming on and discussing it with us. Hopefully we'll get him back later in the summer to hear how that project has progressed. That's it for me for this episode. Again, for updates on our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and get notified of new episodes.